you run into a bunker and they're shooting with the flamethrowers and so on, and you have a battle right there, but it's always at a short distance. So we had then to take this by hand-to-hand combat in order to advance to get their positions.
There was a certain tactic which we tried to take advantage of. We would try to fly about 1,000 meters below the British planes. Then we would wait until they were very close to us, about 200 meters, and suddenly fly up at a steep angle to get above them while firing our machine guns. It was very effective.
The fascination that people, particularly in the West, have with the German army in World War II stems from their very real combat achievements, the perceived superiority of the German soldier in World War II, which is backed up by individual combat records, and by the ghost of the German propaganda machine itself, which built the German Wehrmacht into the mightiest war machine in the world. To some extent, the army could never live up entirely to its propaganda image. But man for man, they inflicted far more casualties on their enemies than their enemies did on them. And this is the basic reason why so many people are fascinated by the period.
The Versailles Treaty, which the Germans signed after their defeat in World War I, greatly restricted Germany's economy and wounded her national pride. Many German citizens felt it was unfair and harsh. Hitler seized this opportunity to build his war machine.
There was a certain enthusiasm in the population for this coming man who promised a lot of things and who did a lot of things, really, for the Germans. And in 34 or 35, there was a great movement in favor of enter the Hitlerjugend, you know, and I followed that, because Hitlerjugend was like scouts in England or America. It was a news movement which was very attractive for us.
As Hitler rose to power, the incredible propaganda machine which he created made military service seem very attractive.
Und die guckten mich, jungen Kerl, immer an, als der Krieg schon ausgebrochen war. Warum
I was brought up under the rule of the Third Reich, and as a boy I just wanted to be a soldier.
Und da habe ich mich zunächst
I had a job at a bank, and people would ask me why I wasn't a soldier yet.
angenommen nach der Musterung.
I volunteered for the paratroopers, but they sent a letter back to me saying that they couldn't accept me until December of 1940.
Dort lag das Ersatzregiment von Fallschirmjägern.
But I didn't want to wait that long.
Das ist jetzt ein typisches Beispiel für die deutsche Jugend vor dem Krieg.
I volunteered as all my classmates did, 15 of them, at the beginning of 1940. Because we thought our country was in danger, we have to do something for the country.
Throughout the 1930s, the German military expanded in secret against the terms of the Versailles Treaty. The basic model of the armed forces still owed much to the Army of World War I.
When Hans von Seeckt basically reformed and reorganized the German army after World War I, he decided to create an entire army that was an elite army. The training standards would be superior, the officers and the NCO standards were to be very high. World War II begins, something like a quarter or a third of the German army, if you count the armored divisions, the motorized divisions, the mountain division, the paratroop division. These can be called elite forces. The brunt of the fighting is done by these forces in 1939, 1940.
The German model for training and equipping an army had worked. It wasn't just propaganda. The German army overpowered all of its early foes and quickly expanded to many parts of the world, even as far as North Africa. Here, a unit known as the Afrika Korps proved it deserved to be considered elite.
The Afrika Korps is undoubtedly the most famous of all of the German formations. Although many people consider it an elite unit, and indeed its fighting record bears that out, initially it was simply a collection of spare German divisions thrown together very hastily in an attempt to prop up the Italian occupation of Libya.
Und das hat sich während der ganzen Zeit in Afrika doch sehr bemerkbar gemacht.
The Afrika Korps was unique because we had to handle all of our problems on our own in the desert. There were no immediate reinforcements. Because of this, we had a great camaraderie. We would share the last bit of bread with a friend. This is how we became an elite group.
Besides the tremendous fighting spirit of the men, the Afrika Korps enjoyed excellent leadership. Erwin Rommel earned his Desert Fox nickname in North Africa because of his ability to outmaneuver and defeat larger enemy forces.
The Afrika Korps became an elite unit because of the caliber of its leadership. Although not looked upon as one of the great strategists of the war, Rommel was unsurpassed as a tactician. He pioneered the use of the 88mm gun as an offensive and defensive weapon in desert warfare. Indeed, he had to do this because he had insufficient numbers of troops, tanks, and support equipment.
Rommel led the men of the Afrika Korps to many early victories over the British despite the harsh desert environment.
Ja, die Waffen waren natürlich ständig verstaubt. Sie mussten also
in the desert, we had to clean our weapons all the time because there was so much dust. The heat was terrible. But the biggest problem was that we never had enough water. Each of us had only 1 liter of water per day, and half of that went to the kitchen, so it was very difficult.
The Afrika Korps had an influence on the battlefield far out of proportion to the numbers of tanks and men that it could field. The actual Afrika Korps itself lasted only a few months. Very quickly, Italian units were absorbed into a combined German-Italian unit, which became Panzer Army Africa.
This larger combined force eventually became trapped in the desert after the Americans landed to the west and the British closed in from the east. Members of the original Afrika Korps were among the many hundreds of thousands of German POWs taken at the end of the Africa campaign. But the pride and camaraderie of this elite unit lives on even today, as evidenced by a gathering of former Afrika Korps members.
Bestaunt sind die Gesichter, doch froh ist unser Sinn, ja unser Sinn. Da draußen im Panzer im Sturmwind dahin.
The panzer units of the German army were the real backbone of Hitler's war machine. The armored units were the fists of steel in the Blitzkrieg, and they quickly overpowered all of their early opponents. Ironically, one of the finest panzer divisions was actually under the control of the Luftwaffe. This unit was known as the Hermann Göring Panzer Division.
The Hermann Göring Panzer Division was one of the more unusual units of the war. There was actually no real reason for the Luftwaffe to have a panzer division in the first place. This was a personal project of Reichsmarshal Goering. It had an admirable fighting record. It was extremely well equipped. It was one of the units to which German soldiers were more or less promoted.
The Hermann Göring Division fought on both fronts during World War II and was highly regarded for its record in the Italian campaign. Because of the high political position of Göring, his division was always well equipped.
It was one of the units that had a more or less favored status in the German supply organization. Part of this was no doubt due to the political influence of Reichsmarshal Goering, but the fact that the unit was so effective in combat meant that it was important to keep it well supplied and well equipped so that it could do the job that it was assigned to do. They had their own organic unit of Tiger tanks, which alone would identify them as an elite unit because very few divisions had their own Tiger tanks.
The Tiger and Panther tanks were Germany's most advanced tanks. The 60-ton Tigers could overpower any of the Allied armor. The only handicap for the Hermann Göring Division was a complicated chain of command, since they were under both Luftwaffe and Army control on the battlefield. But despite this, the unit still performed very well.
Patton himself is alleged to have said that the Hermann Göring Panzer Division was the finest division in any army, which, coming from blood and guts, was certainly extremely high praise.
Another unique and elite panzer unit was the Großdeutschland Division.
The Großdeutschland Division was a division specifically recruited from all over Germany. Most German formations were actually local or regional in nature. 3rd Panzer Division, for example, was raised primarily in Berlin. The 1st Cavalry Division came from Vienna in Austria. Großdeutschland, Greater Germany, was intended to provide one unit from which troops could be drawn from all over Germany.
Großdeutschland fought primarily on the Eastern Front and was involved in the Kursk Offensive in July of 1943, one of the largest tank battles in all of World War II.
Wir haben an sich den T-34 nicht gefürchtet.
We felt we had received better training than the Russians. We weren't scared even when they outnumbered us. In fact, in one battle, our tank knocked out 22 Russian tanks. We were always fighting in the most extreme situations. We were constantly facing the best of the Russian troops and huge numbers of Russian troops. That is why I think Großdeutschland is an elite division.
Probably the most talent-laden of all the elite Panzer Division was the Panzerlehr Division. It was not formed until 1943, but was quickly regarded as one of the best units in the entire army.
When it was formed in late 1943, its cadre of officers, NCOs, and men came from all of the German armor training schools throughout Germany. As a result, the division, even when formed, had a very high number of combat veterans who were also extremely skilled in all aspects of armored warfare, as they would have to be in order to be instructors. The other distinguishing feature of Panzerlehr was its lavish equipment.
The schools had always the newest arms, the newest tanks, the newest weapons and so on. And that's why the Panzerlehr was really perhaps the best equipped German Panzer Division at the end of the war. We had the newest tanks, we had the Panther tanks and the Tiger tanks. Everything was very modern and very, very useful.
Since it was formed late in the war, Panzerlehr was sent to the Western Front before the Normandy landings as the Allies were massing their forces in England.
The strongest unit that the Germans had behind the Normandy beaches was the Panzerlehr Division. And this was not an SS, but a Wehrmacht unit. And it was, without doubt, the most powerful division that the Germans had available on the Western Front in June of 1944.
Despite their vast experience and lavish equipment, Panzerlehr fell victim to the Allies' devastating aerial firepower in Normandy.
Half of the division has been swept out by only one bombing for 120 enemy bombers, flying fortresses, who swept out the half of the division.
The idea of forming a panzer division from instructors at first sounded like a good idea, in that you would, of course, have this tremendous pool of talent and combat skill. In the long run, of course, it was a disaster, because by taking so many instructors out of the schools, you cut the quality of instruction, which in turn affected all of the panzer divisions, not just Panzerlehr.
The Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, quickly became regarded as one of the finest air forces in the world. Probably the most famous of the elite Luftwaffe unit was known as JG-26.
In the Luftwaffe, Jagdgeschwader 26, Schlegeter, was probably the finest fighter wing in the entire German Air Force. It was formed before the war. It fought in the Battle of Britain and the Battle of France. It served almost entirely in the West until the defense of Germany itself.
In the campaign in the spring of 1940, when France is overrun, JG-26 will fly in support of the Luftwaffe bombers in France. They have a pretty average record as far as fighter groups. They really hit their stride during the Battle of Britain, where they're one of the top performing German fighter wings against the RAF in Britain.
Die Zahlen, die wir also angaben als Abschüsse, nicht? Und
it seemed to us that things were going very well during the Battle of Britain.
Das machte einen falschen Eindruck. Wir nahmen eigentlich
We had to fly only at very short distances so we could accompany our bombers into London.
Zahl abgeschossen hätten, als wirklich also da vorhanden waren.
We also felt very confident because the Me-109 had better guns than the British planes.
Die 109 damals, wir hatten also 2 Kanonen in den Flächen.
The pilots of JG-26 quickly built up a very impressive combat record, although the pilots still felt there was a certain amount of chivalry left in the air war.
Die Maschine wurde angegriffen und musste gehindert werden,
We thought more in terms of planes than in people. And when a pilot managed to bail out, we would say, well, he's made it, that's okay. But we also counted how many planes we shot down because we were very proud of our fighting record.
As the war progressed, the German pilots, who had enjoyed superior numbers early on, now found themselves on the defensive. However, they did have the advantage of fighting over their own territory.
The Germans will be able to operate at close range, whereas the RAF, which is flying in now across the channel, is operating at the furthest extent of its range against the Germans. And a good many of the Brits are going to be lost because they run out of fuel over enemy territory. Or the Brits will have to break off battle because of fuel problems. The Germans, of course, are flying almost on top of their own airfields. So the Germans are able to watch the British come in across the channel. They're able to sit back, bring their forces together, and attack at the proper moment because they have this good intelligence on the British. All of these things taken together, and the fact that JG-26 had first-rate aircraft, account for a very good record that JG-26 had.
Some of JG-26's success has to be owed to the very high number of sorties they flew, although something also has to be said for the bravery and skill of the pilots.
Es war das Geschwader in dem
I think we were the toughest fighter unit, and we were always facing the most skilled adversaries. I know if we had fought under more fair conditions, we would have done even better. But at the end, there were just so many more Allied planes that it was very difficult for us.
Natürlich, also stolz ist vielleicht ein falscher Eindruck, nicht? Aber also man.
I guess we were proud of the number of planes we shot down. But we weren't as concerned with our personal numbers compared to how we performed as a unit. Also, I would imagine that what we felt was very different than killing someone on the ground, because we could only see the plane, not the person. However, I do remember that I managed to shoot down 45 enemy planes.
One of the most unique fighter groups of the Luftwaffe was known as JV-44. This unit emerged towards the end of the war and was a collection of some of the best pilots from all over the Luftwaffe, flying the new Me-262 jet aircraft.
JV-44 sees only about 3-4 months of combat in World War II. The unit is formed in January 1945 from really a collection of star pilots from the Luftwaffe.
JV-44 was formed by Adolf Galland, who had formerly been a member of JG-26 and was head of the German fighter force. Because of Galland's excellent reputation, he was able to lure many of the Luftwaffe's best pilots to JV-44.
Most of the pilots in JV-44 were experienced senior line commanders, and many of them had more than 100 victories. A couple had more than 200. They were extremely effective, although Galland himself admits that they never entirely figured out tactics that were ideally suited to the Me-262.
This unit did see considerable action in the first 3 months of 1945. There were some days in which they caused some considerable Allied casualties. However, there was very heavy losses and attrition among JV-44, the stage of the war. They might be able to outfly the Allies in a dogfight, and the Me-262 was a tremendous plane for speed, but they could catch the 262s on landing.
Another problem was that the new jet engines were mechanically unreliable. Pilots were often forced to disengage from combat and glide to the ground. However, when the Me-262 did work properly, the skill of the pilots and the performance of the aircraft were extremely effective.
The few times that this unit was able to attack massed Allied bomber forces, it caused tremendous losses, and one can only imagine what would have happened to the 8th Air Force had Germany been able to develop its engine technology a year earlier, and Me-262s had been available in wing strength by the summer of 1944. It would have been a horrendous thing indeed. The German mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, were considered elite units because of their extensive training in mountain climbing, rock climbing, alpine skiing, their special skills in living in the harsh climate of alpine regions. They were extremely skilled in rough terrain fighting. They were well equipped for their tasks. They had snowshoes, skis. They used a variety of lightweight weapons.
I was very sporty. I was 18 years old, and I was a state champion in ski racing and downhill and slalom, so I didn't have difficulties getting in there. Then they gave us our training in the Großglockner Mountain on ice training, and you had to climb for this 11 hours with heavy gear up to 120 pounds, climb a 15,000 foot mountain and in 11 hours back again, and then you got a warm soup. That was all.
The Gebirgsjäger troops were chosen for their intelligence, their self-reliance, the ability to adapt to a wide variety of combat conditions. And it was not unusual for an entire unit to be considered potential leaders.
Each company could completely function as a battalion by itself. So we, not just an infantry company, and the other one was just a mortar company, or so on, or just artillery. We had this all in one company, because in the high mountains you are completely on your own. You have no support, you have no supplies coming up, you cannot call for help. I need firepower. If you don't give it yourself, it's your own fault.
In a battle in the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia, Wolfgang Seip's unit displayed the type of extreme bravery required to earn elite status.
We were completely cut off and decimated down to about 15 men, and we had no ammunition anymore. And I got the order to go toward the Russian line and pick up a machine gun 32, the only one which still was available and which still had ammunition in, but the machine gunner was killed. So I crawled over and saw it standing, and I was getting up and bending down to grab it with my right hand, and I saw 6 feet away a Soviet soldier standing up with his rifle and shooting at me, and he shot me right toward the heart. I have a scar here, and I knew I have to play dead because they never shoot at a dead person. So I was screaming, falling back, laying on my back and compressing my radial artery that I don't bleed to death. And through my eyelashes I could see that he was turning around and running away. At this moment I took my belt, put it around, and grabbed the machine gun and crawled back. We lost 64 men in an afternoon in our company, and that was the end of our existence. We were only then 15 left, and I am one of 6 survivors. The whole company of 380 men was wiped out within 8 weeks.
Like many elite units, the mountain troops took heavy casualties because they were given the most difficult missions. Another common problem for specialized units was being used as regular line infantry as the number of available German soldiers began to shrink as the war progressed.
I'm not sure if they felt resentment being used as ordinary infantry, although I'm sure they probably questioned the wisdom of breaking up specialized elite units with particular skills to fight as ordinary line infantry, although this was a problem across the Wehrmacht, from the SS to the Army and even the Luftwaffe.
The highly skilled paratroopers in the German armed forces fell under the control of the Luftwaffe. They were often used in a regular infantry capacity, although they also had many spectacular successes as airborne troops in different theaters of the war.
Paratroopers were particularly considered elite because of their jump qualification, the fact that they were paratroopers. Like the mountain troops, they were also chosen for their fitness, their intelligence, and their adaptability, in common with many other elite units. They were trained as infantry first and then received specialized jump training.
Paratroopers were involved in one of the earliest actions of World War II when the Belgian fortress of Ibn Emal was attacked by a combined force of airborne and ground engineers. This heavily defended fort had to be taken in order for the German army to move into France.
This was a glider assault force comprised largely of parachute engineers whose objective was to capture the fort and destroy fortifications that they could not silence by other means. It was extremely effective. The Belgians never thought that the Germans could capture the fort because it was considered impregnable.
The largest German airborne operation of World War II was the invasion of Crete in 1941. The Allies had been forced out of Greece, and Crete was their last stronghold in the Mediterranean. On May 20, hundreds of Ju-52 transport planes appeared over the horizon carrying thousands of paratroopers. Airborne troops began landing all over the island, taking some heavy casualties from the British as they descended. Eventually, the German troops captured the main airfield on the island and gradually forced the Allies off the island. The mission was a great success, but also a very costly one.
The paratroops suffered very high losses, not only in men and equipment, but also in aircraft. And although General Student praised his men for the successful capture of their objectives on the island of Crete, the Germans never again mounted a full airborne assault. It simply had proved to be too costly for highly skilled and expensively trained troops to try again.
German paratroopers still performed admirably throughout the rest of the war. However, now they were confined to fighting as regular infantry, mainly in defensive positions instead of their more specialized role. They were some of the toughest combatants for the Allies during the Normandy fighting, but their most famous defensive stand occurred at Monte Cassino in Italy. This town was dominated by a 6th century hilltop abbey. The Allies were unable to advance to Rome as long as the Germans held the high ground around the village. Finally, a decision was made to reduce the monastery to rubble. However, the tenacious German paratroopers simply used the remaining rubble as a fortress and prevented any Allied advance for months against overwhelmingly superior numbers.
The British General Alexander at Monte Cassino said that the 1st Parachute Panzer Division was the best division in any army on any front, and that is high praise indeed.
Probably the most controversial of all the German military units was the SS, or Schutzstaffel. The SS began as an elite bodyguard and police unit for the Nazi Party in 1925. However, when World War II started, the SS had been divided into 2 different branches: the Allgemeinen SS, which still functioned as an internal police unit, and the Waffen-SS, frontline combat units.
The Waffen-SS, particularly as the war progressed, tended to identify more and more closely with the regular German Wehrmacht, and to consider itself an arm, albeit a very elite arm, of the regular German armed forces, as much as Himmler wanted to turn the SS, the armed SS, into the ideological vanguard of National Socialism. In that effort, he was largely unsuccessful.
Young people won't understand this today, but I was proud of joining the Waffen-SS. At the time, it had a very good reputation. But today, when you hear SS, it is associated with many terrible things. I think it was a great mistake by Himmler not to separate more clearly the Waffen-SS on the front from the concentration camp SS.
Unfortunately, the Waffen-SS was somewhat linked to the terrible atrocities taking place at the concentration camps. They would often provide perimeter security while convalescing from frontline injuries. But for the most part, the frontline SS combat troops resent being confused with the police units attached to the concentration camps.
I would think that the majority of SS veterans do feel resentful that the German High Command, especially the High Command of the Waffen-SS and the Allgemeine SS under Himmler, arranged things so that there were these hard, almost inextricable links between the concentration camp system and the Waffen-SS field units. The average SS veteran feels that he was a soldier fighting for his country rather than a war criminal. And I'm sure that most of them feel that way to the present day.
At the beginning of the war, there were only a handful of Waffen-SS divisions, all of which prided themselves on their purity of German descent. However, as the number of German soldiers began to decline towards the end of the war, the SS was rapidly expanded. The quality of the men began to decline. Foreigners were allowed in, and the number of SS divisions swelled to 38.
When we look at the Waffen-SS as an elite organization, an elite fighting force, what we're really looking at are the so-called classic SS divisions. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, which was the first SS division, the second SS Das Reich, the third SS Totenkopfer Death Head unit, and the fifth SS Viking. Those four classic SS divisions I named won 55% of all Knight's Crosses awarded to Waffen-SS and police units during the war.
The Das Reich SS Panzer Division fought on both the eastern and western fronts during the war. And like the Panzerlehr Division, Das Reich felt the full force of the Allies' air superiority while in Normandy.
There were two philosophies when these enormous air attacks started: either to jump out of the car and crawl under it, or to keep in there. Definitely, most of the crews jumped out. I was sticking to the other theory. We said the safest place is right in here.
One of the more unique SS divisions also fought in Normandy, the 12th SS, or Hitler Youth Division. As a more experienced officer, Peter Prien was loaned to the 12th SS during the Normandy fighting.
I have no hesitation to say that within the fight they were equal to none, and where to us they seemed to be fair. Everyone was about 18, 19, 20 years old. So, awful. They were full of courage. They were a fantastic fighting unit.
There is no doubt that some of the frontline SS divisions were involved in war crimes against civilians and Allied soldiers, particularly on the Eastern Front, where both sides fought a very brutal war. Because of these crimes and the despicable goals of the Nazi regime, many German veterans who fought within the rules of war continue to suffer today. They live in a country that is still trying to come to terms with its experiences in World War II.
Der Gegner, der Engländer oder Amerikaner, der wird dann so richtig Cowboy.
Today, the English and American veterans are portrayed as cowboys or heroes. And in Germany, we are portrayed as being stupid, which is not fair, because we were sacrificing and dying for our country too.
Das kann der kleine Soldat nicht entscheiden.
In the end, Hitler's war machine simply ran out of men and materiel. But the fighting spirit of the elite German forces continued through the final days.
Time and again, it would, until almost the end of the war, it would demonstrate its recuperative powers. When the fighting in Normandy ended, the German army in the West did not have more than 100 tanks, September 1944. Yet, in December of 44, they were able to launch, during the Battle of the Bulge, a tremendous offensive which took the Allies totally off guard and was something that the Allies had felt that the Germans couldn't have ever mounted in that strength at that time, given the losses that they had suffered.
It was an army that was more worn down in a battle of attrition than it was an army that was defeated by force of arms. It was never supplied as well as most of the Allies, especially after 1943. And also, one has to admit that German propaganda built the Wehrmacht into the mightiest military machine in the world. And to some extent, the ghost of that influence still hangs over the record of the German army in World War II.
I don't know if they felt that they could still win the war, but the bond between the soldiers in the German Wehrmacht, and particularly in the SS, was so strong. The Germans had a term for it, a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, a community of fate. They had been brought together by fate to fight, and if they no longer believed in National Socialism, if they no longer believed in ultimate victory, they believed in themselves and in the duty and the responsibility that they had to one another.